So I'll introduce myself. My name is Ben Schonberger. I'm a board member at Housing Land Advocates, and I'm also a land use planner for Winterbrook Planning. Winterbrook Planning is one of the name sponsors of the event. There's a contingent of us here, so shout out to my employer and sponsor of. We do land use and environmental planning. That's a small group of us here in downtown Portland. So now that we've covered that, I would like to give an overview of our next panel, which is about system development charges. So wow, I saw somebody raise their hands in excitement. So this may be the nerdiest of our panels in terms of it's a pretty obscure corner of planning and public finance, but I think at the heart of it is really, really interesting. And I hope to pull some of that apart when we talk about it today. I think, SDC is one of those acronyms that sort of puts you in the know, like FAR or TSP. And there's only, a certain subset of people who understand and care what these things are. But I guess we're that subset. So that's what we're going to talk about it. Briefly stated, an SDC or an impact fee, we can sort of talk about those in equivalent ways, is a per unit charge on new development that's used to pay for public infrastructure like water pipes or parks. I think that's a fair elevator pitch for what is an SDC. So it sounds simple, but there's actually a whole lot to it. Quietly, they're a key piece of the puzzle for how local governments pay for their infrastructure. And without them, these governments would have a lot fewer dollars available to provide things like sewers that we need to make our cities function. On the flip side, though, as we all learn in Econ 101, they're effectively a tax on new construction, which on the margins suppresses housing construction. So the purpose of this session is to unpack the issues around SDCs. First of all, what are they? How do they work? How do they impact affordability and production of housing? Do they actually drive development decisions? And how critical are they as a source of funding for the infrastructure that we all use? So the original idea for this panel came out of a report. There's a new report that is hot off the presses as of January of this year from Oregon Housing and Community Services that is all about SDCs. It discusses these issues. I do want to give a shout out to Eco Northwest, who was the consulting firm that led that project. And one of our panelists is the project lead from OHCS, so she knows a lot about it. So Vecchio is here. I wanted to acknowledge her. This is a very thorough and deep study. It's 236 pages, all about SDCs. So I encourage you to look it up and dig deep into every last detail of it. I think it's important to pull out one quote from that study. It says the study was explicitly, quote, not intended to pit SDCs against housing production or affordability, but rather to clarify how they interact, end quote. So I think that's in the spirit of that. That's what we're doing here today as well. It does raise a ton of interesting issues, and it goes into a lot more detail than we can cover here, but look it up if you have more interest in it. This panel, I think, walks the same ground as that report. And it brings the idea of impact fees and SDCs to a wider audience and a more interactive setting where we can talk about pluses and minuses and things that could change or not about them. And we have a lot of smart people in the room, so let's dig in. So speaking of those smart people, I'd like to introduce my esteemed panel of experts on the topic. Begin with, as I said, the project lead for that report. To my immediate left is Elise Cordle Kennedy. I wrote down her bio just a second ago that she gave me. I've got it. So Elise is Senior Research Analyst at the Oregon Housing and Community Services. She specializes in data visualization, data and research justice, and equitable program evaluation. Before she worked at OHCS, she worked at the Oregon Community Foundation. And I think, as we all do in planning and housing, had a previous career as an opera singer. I didn't make that up. She was the project lead for the SDC study that came out in January. To her left is Paul Del Vecchio. Paul is president of Ethos Development. They are a Portland-based real estate development firm that's active on the West Coast. So he actually builds the housing that we're all talking about today. Prior to founding Ethos, Paul worked in development and construction management, financial analysis, and consulting for both public and private organizations. He has undergraduate and graduate degrees in engineering and also a master's of business administration. And he serves on advisory groups for both the Portland Housing Bureau and Central City Concern. To his left is Anna Slatinsky. Anna has been planning division manager in the city of Beaverton, Oregon, since 2016. She was previously deputy director of the Brooklyn Office of City Planning in New York City. She engages in policy and regulatory approaches for housing, transportation, sustainability, industrial areas, and urban design. She has degrees from Hampshire College in Massachusetts and Hunter College in New York, and she is currently on the board of the Oregon chapter of the American Planning Association. So we have, I think, some really interesting perspectives on the topics of SDCs. And with that, I'd like to kick it off. We're going to go in the order that I just announced people. So we'll go first with Elise.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks. Good to be with all of you. I just want to say I have to follow Andrea, my boss. So whoever did the sort of program lineup, I'd like to have a word with you on that, because this going in a very different direction from aspirational and inspirational to very nerdy. So come along with me as we talk about system development charges. Oh, I need the clicker. Okay. So that's the wrong direction. No. Do I have to be closer? That way? Okay, I got it. One more. So Ben kind of talked us through this. Sucks. It's kind of tough. I don't know. Maybe it's me. It's probably me. Yeah. So Ben talked us through what a system development charge is. I'm going to talk quickly about the report. So in 2021, the Oregon State Legislature passed House Bill 3040, which directed us, OHCS, Oregon Housing and Community Services, to study system development charges and their role as a cost driver in developing housing. So we contracted with Echo Northwest. Becky Hewitt is here. She was our project manager on that. Shout out to her. If I get anything wrong, sorry. The Gallardi-Rothstein group and FCS group, who are sort of the methodological rate setting experts, way smarter folks than I am. So I got to be a part of working on this report with them. And we released the study in December. And the report is broken up into a couple of key sections, including the history of SDCs, the legal context, their role in funding infrastructure, and then how they affect housing costs. I'm going to try again. Yes, great. So what is an SDC? Now mine isn't moving. Okay. SDCs, as Paul mentioned, they're called impact fees, or my personal favorite is a tap-in fee, because it taps, each new housing unit taps into the system of infrastructure, whether that's water into your house or there's more people on the roads. And so there's an additional tug on the system that's happening when you build a new place to live. So system development charges provide the additional resources that are needed to fund and maintain infrastructure. There's a survey that's done by the League of Oregon Cities on a nearly annual basis that sort of looks at cities and special districts and how they use system development charges. And of the, I think it was 179 cities that were surveyed, 66% of cities are using at least one type of system development charge. These types are parks, sewers, water, transportation, and stormwater. And the first SDC was enacted, sort of passed in Oregon in 1972. An Oregon statute allows local governments to set up their own individual methodology, and it requires them to do a capital or a master plan before they enact an SDC. If you want a deeper dive on the methodology, see Section 3 of the report. So why do we need them? Why do we need SDCs? There are lots of ways to fund infrastructure, and the federal government was a strong funder of infrastructure until the 1980s. Funding of federal infrastructure, as you see, nope, that's not the right graph. As you see in this graph, starts to decline in the 1980s, and local government now has to start to rely more and more on local funding as federal funding declines. So today, federal dollars make up around 25% of the funding for infrastructure, transportation and water infrastructure, which means that when funding federally declines, local governments need to rely on other sources of funding. Enter SDCs. At the same time that federal funding is decreasing, other things like costs are increasing. It costs money to build infrastructure. So that's the cost of construction, the cost of repair. There's also, this is important to note, an increase in the passing of different regulations, environmental, and all kinds of other regulations that make things like roads, air, water safer and better for people. And these are great things, but they also lead to costs in the development process. They add time, they add administrative time. So they're important, but they also add a level of complexity to the mix. So at the same time that federal funding is declining and costs are increasing, something else is happening: property taxes. Property taxes are complicated, and I'm not here to give you a deep dive on property taxes in the state of Oregon, but I'm sure you could take a property tax accountant, economist, someone out to lunch, and they would tell you all about it. I'm going to just kind of quickly talk you through Measure 5 and Measure 50 and how this impacts funding for infrastructure across the state. So there's a movement sort of across the country in the 80s and 90s to limit property taxes. The property measure 5 is the first thing that happens in the state of Oregon. If you want an interesting podcast on this, Malcolm Gladwell does this great podcast about the history of property taxes and uses Prop 13 outside of California to take you through this. So that's interesting. You should check that out. Measure 5 in Oregon is the first thing that happens, and it essentially limits the property tax rate. So before 1991, Oregon has a levy-based property tax system. And that leads to a sort of annual revenue generation of about $26 of an average tax rate for every $1,000 that your home is valued at. This rate is set by taxing districts according to their local needs. I'm not going to talk about how that happens, but essentially Measure 5 comes along and says, you know what, scrap that. That's too confusing. We're going to limit the tax rate to $5 for every $1,000 of the value of your property. We'll give that to schools, and then $10 for every $1,000 for the general government. So that in turn cuts the local revenue by about 51% across the state. Measure 5 comes along, that also changes things, that takes us from real value to assessed value. You can see how that really changes over time. And so real value and assessed value sort of used to increase together in sort of this nice parallel relationship, and that changes with Measure 50. Go to the next slide. So when we think about paying for infrastructure and why SDCs are charged at all, it's important to understand how much is being charged for each type of SDCs. So this graph shows the cost of SDCs in 2007 and in 2022. As you can see, parks and transportation are increasing at a faster rate than others. In addition to the increase in construction costs, which leads to this increase in SDCs, there are other factors other than construction costs for new facilities that make SDCs more costly. These things include other regulations, like we talked about, escalating land costs, or possibly just an underreporting of SDCs in 2007. So this creates a $15,000 total average for each of the combined jurisdictions for each type of infrastructure that we see here. I'm not going to talk you through the SDC methodologies and the different rates that they are set at, but something that's really important to know is that Oregon statute allows governments and special districts to do their own methodology. The methodology is complicated. It takes a year-long process. Some of the folks who wrote this report are key individuals in designing and implementing SDC methodologies. Those of you who have done this have probably worked with them before. And local governments take a lot of things into account when they're setting their methodology, including like what other governments around them are doing, how the costs are broken up between the current user of an infrastructure system and a new user, other grants and funding sources that are available to make upgrades to the systems of infrastructure that we all use all the time. And one last thing here to note is that once the rate is set, once the methodology is done and all that really hard, interesting, fascinating work is done, the methodology says, okay, you can charge X amount of money for your SDCs legally for this type of infrastructure. A lot of local jurisdictions are not actually charging the full amount that their rate is set at. Sometimes they charge below or even well below their methodology for a lot of reasons, but often to remain competitive or stimulate other types of production and economic development. So because SDCs are a cost, they're one of the many costs to build housing, they do affect the cost of housing. However, the ratio of SDCs to the total development cost and how that affects development varies widely across the state, across regions, across housing types, and whether or not there are exceptions for affordable housing. I think this is the part in the conversation where we really talk about the difference between developing market rate housing and develop affordable housing. When we talked to developers, we had a really robust and interesting stakeholder process, and developers were, of course, a primary part of that process. We talked mostly with developers who work in market rate housing. And one of the things that we heard from developers in these focus groups is that they decide what and where to build primarily on the market. So they do possibly respond to SDC costs. And some ways that they respond to that are that they build smaller homes or bigger homes. They develop in invest in middle housing. Developers shared that SDCs are one of many factors that determine where they build. There are other factors that may outweigh SDC costs sometimes, and that includes things like land, the cost of land, the market conditions, and permitting time, or the permit requirements in that area. SDCs are sometimes, according to the developers that we talk to, enough of a hurdle to make a development infeasible, especially in cost-sensitive types of housing like entry-level or middle housing. Multifamily production can be affected by SDCs, but a lot of developers noted that when the SDC rates are low enough, they have a relatively limited impact on multifamily development. I love this graph because it shows a couple of really interesting things, right? It shows the cost, the share of SDCs in the cost of development, both for different housing types and in different regions across the country, across the state. So we're looking at two things. We're looking at regional and geographic differences, and then also the difference in the types of housing. So we can see that in the metro area, SDCs make up anywhere from 6 to 12% of the cost of development. And SDCs are a smaller share of the cost of development for larger single family homes. And then for smaller, they're a bigger cost. They're a bigger proportion of development. So if we think about the average cost of like 1 to 6% for a single family, and then compare that to the average cost for a multifamily home, which, as you can see on the graph, averages between 5 and 12%, we can see that SDCs definitely have a significant impact on development of multifamily or low-rise apartments. This study also, when we look at affordable housing specifically, found that SDCs likely consume millions of dollars every year in the funding of affordable housing. So some takeaways. SDCs affect housing costs, and they affect certain types of housing more than others. SDCs for affordable housing, as we mentioned, can cost a lot of money. But what's important to understand is that there are other cost drivers, like we talked about, land, permitting time, hard costs, and these really can vary geographically. So we have to recognize also that SDCs can skew development more towards high-cost homes because of the graph that we just saw, than because of the effect that they have on single-family high-cost homes is lower than what they have on multifamily. Another finding was that the timing of payments, there's a whole section that's really interesting on the timing of when this fee is paid. So the timing of payments can make a big difference. The rate structure, whether it is applied per housing type or square footage, whether there are SDC credits for developers, which is also a really interesting thing that you can definitely talk to Becky about. Affordable housing waivers, all of these things make a difference how and where a developer decides to pursue housing. SDCs are complicated, they are localized, and they are an important part of local government funding. And so this begs the question of how can we improve this process in supporting and funding local infrastructure as we also think about incentivizing housing development and economic growth? How can we design a system that incentivizes production, specifically affordable housing production, to meet the governor's new housing production goals and ensure that all Oregonians have access to safe and affordable housing? I will hand it over to Paul.
Thank you.
Good luck with the clicker.
Everyone. Take a minute to try to work this tech out.
It's all lined up, so
Oh,
it should
right
just
here.
roll through to the next presentation, I think. Just keep it right. Good.
Great. There we go. That wasn't that hard. As was mentioned before, my name's Paul Del Vecchio. I run a market rate development company here in Portland. Market rate kind of has an asterisk. In a lot of ways, we do things that are affordable, but they're privately funded, and they're also lowercase a affordable, so more accessibly priced than affordable generally means subsidized in some way or rent restricted. The only purchases that we do are related to like inclusionary housing, or we got a tax exemption, in Washington that requires some amount of affordable. But we pay attention to affordable housing. I think it's worth just kind of pausing on that concept for a second, because several distinctions have been drawn between affordable and market rate housing. And you'll see lots of needs analysis that will say that so many housing units are required between X and Y, Y and Z percent of AMI. But if you overproduce at the top, developers left to their own devices will overproduce. Today's luxury is tomorrow's affordable if it doesn't absorb. So filtering happens, and you can easily create workforce housing by overproducing housing at the top end. And removing obstacles to market rate is generally a good thing for affordable housing, because the overwhelming majority of housing produced in this country is private, private capital and private delivery. So kind of worth noting. I don't know how much of this group is kind of on the development side versus planning and government, but it's just worth noting. So there is a lot of overlap here. I think just a much more granular version of what you just saw. I just broke out some projects from the last few years just to show how the systems development charges, these are all in Portland. So this certainly, I know this is, kind of a wider Oregon lens, but we don't work anywhere else in Oregon at the moment. So, that is in the mix for what Elise just said, between, I think, 5 and 12% or so. The one thing that's tough when looking at that information this granular is that what was on the site previously matters, because it is deducted from the SDCs that you're required to pay. So if there was a fourplex and we took it down to build 130 units, it is minus 4 units. And it's not exactly that, because it might have been bigger units that have more of a credit, and there may have been more hose bibs. It gets very, very granular. But the other part is what you are building. So the smaller the unit, generally, the less impact fees are associated with it. So on the right there, I've got some notes about what they are. Generally, our buildings skew smaller, so there's some consistency, but it's not totally consistent. So I just tried to give you a broad brush. And on the one on the bottom had some heavy SDCs that there was a big offset, which is why it's 4.6%. But there kind of is a broad upward trajectory, and I think that's something kind of I want to get into on the next slide, is how construction costs have changed and other costs versus SDCs. So we've seen some tremendous increases in SDCs. And if you took the information that Elise showed, that was for single family, and then broke out the Portland part, went from 2007 to 2020, you'd see that it was 8.5% annualized increases in SDCs. In the last 2 years, there's been 8.5% annualized construction cost increases, and we're calling it an inflation catastrophe. And it's halting construction all over the country. How it's justified that happened for that many years in a row is beyond me, but it doesn't seem like a reasonable thing to burden housing production with, especially at that rate of increase. As a percentage, when you look at what the SDCs are as it relates to the total project, everything increased. That just increased more, so you're not going to see that level of increase as a percentage of the total project, but it is becoming more and more of a burden over time. And that is a drag. So the way one would look at a development project to understand if it's viable or not, is take the sum of the total costs. That includes everything from finance costs, interest reserves to pay your interest while you're under construction, to the land, development fee, contractor, everything, and divide it by your NOI or net operating income. That produces a yield on cost, which is, as close to a financing agnostic return metric as you can get. So if you just removed SDCs out of a project, we're seeing 20 to 25 basis point or 0.25% change in performance. That is enough for someone to invest or not invest in a project. It is very clear. It's meaningful enough to mean go, no go. And, I'm not naive to the reality that the infrastructure needs to get paid for somehow, and it is necessary. The question is who is paying for it and when, and who does it benefit? So, new developments are also burdened with other infrastructure costs that are not SDCs, and it's not, SDCs are not a net of those costs. So local jurisdictions will also often say, well, your building is affecting the nearby intersection in a certain way, change it. And there's not much leverage for one project or one developer to argue with them. So you eat the 120 grand. That's also an SDC, right? It is literally the same thing. It is the effect that your building is having on the infrastructure nearby. So there's a lot of double dipping that happens, and it sort of flies under the radar. I don't know that there's any real data on it because this is a whole host of individual actors trying to get their projects through. And the jurisdictions collecting the money are different. I think practically what all this means is that you've got, new residents that are not yet represented or identified bearing the burden for this new infrastructure that the entire community benefits from. And especially considering the dramatic cost of SDC increases and the fact that they didn't previously exist, you've got housing stock, be it for rent that's owned, by a corporate entity or, individual owners, increasing in value because the cost to reproduce it is higher. So parties that are not contributing to this new infrastructure are actually getting the benefit of other unrepresented people paying for it. And it's not really an equitable distribution of these costs. For what it's worth, we also work in Washington. There are not these costs, but there's a 10% sales tax. So economically, the projects work out almost the same. It's just a question of how the fees are paid for. So I don't think just deleting them is ever a possibility, but I think rethinking how the money is collected and where it goes is worth considering. And just for, on our projects, the annual property taxes, which, if the system weren't so broken and frozen in time, again, have lunch with your friendly tax attorney to discuss in more detail. That would be the likely source of income. For us, if we build a new building, the SDCs are made up for in about 6 or 7 years, but the tax keeps going forever. So, why is that not sufficient? And this point, the second bullet here, I think this one is really important. And if we're getting very granular on this, when SDCs are paid, I think is really worth considering. They're typically paid up front as a condition of getting your building permit. But if they are literally tied to impact, there aren't occupants there for another 2 years on a multifamily project, maybe 9 to 12 months for a single family project. They could be paid in arrears, and that would help projects a lot. Right now, construction debt is, north of 6%. If you paid $2 million, it's, more than $120,000 you just paid to finance the $2 million. So just the fact that it exists so early is a meaningful component of the story. And I don't know if you guys all know what an LID is, local improvement district. It's a mechanism governments can use to basically impose infrastructure on you. So if you had a home, and it didn't have sidewalks or the road wasn't paved, and collectively the government thought it was a good idea to put in sidewalks and pave the road. They could just do it and then, assess your property. I believe there's some public engagement process for you to be able to agree to that, at least as a community. But then they carry it, and it's carried for, I don't know, I think it's a 30-year mortgage, essentially a second mortgage at a relatively modest interest rate. I don't see why SDCs would be any different. I think something like that could be subordinated to a senior loan would be very helpful. And then one kind of last point here, it's hard for me to understand why we're providing new infrastructure to agencies that can't afford to maintain the existing infrastructure. It seems like we're creating, sort of a worse problem than already exists. SDCs are limited to creating new infrastructure because the whole concept is that they're meant to be paying for the use of the new people, not paying to maintain what already existed for the existing people. So, but it's hard to understand how agencies that can't maintain their assets with the funding they have will be able to maintain new assets when they build them. I think, yeah, okay. So yeah, that's what I've got. Maybe we can get to questions and answers later, and I'll turn it over to Anna.
All right, my turn to make sure the clicker works. All right, cool. Hi. Well, this is awesome. I'm really happy that I have the chance to participate in this panel. I also want to start with the disclaimer, which is that I'm a city planner. I'm not an SDC expert. I'm not an infrastructure finance expert. I'm not a city finance expert. I'm also going to be in a little bit of a vulnerable position here. You know, that thing where they're like, oh, if you're nervous about public speaking, imagine the audience in their underwear. Well, I'm going to be sharing some specific information about Beaverton SDCs. So you can just imagine that I kind of feel like I'm up here in my underwear. So be understanding. SDCs, as has been, clearly discussed, is important for building infrastructure. It also has an effect on housing. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about city finance at a really high level. I'm going to talk a little bit about Beaverton and Beaverton's kind of somewhat unusual status with regard to service provision. And then I'm going to share some case studies of some infrastructure projects that were funded by SDCs, and also some specific projects, and show exactly what the SDCs, well, okay, I rounded, but what the SDCs were for a multifamily project and for a detached single unit home, all kind of in the same area. So here we go. All right, what do cities do? This is kind of about how cities pay for stuff. Well, why do they need to pay for stuff? Cities provide services and governance to a particular geographic area. There are probably academics who can have a much more subtle definition of what cities do, but I think this is efficient for today's conversation. Those services actually vary a lot. We heard that 66% of jurisdictions in the state levy SDCs. I'm like, only 66? How do they do their stuff? But part of the variable is that different cities actually provide different services. And those services often include utilities, public safety, transportation, social services, permitting, code enforcement, but they are not all the same. How do the cities pay for the stuff that they do? Right? Elise did a great job talking about the history of property taxes in Oregon. There are, similar stories in other states, but property taxes are a really fundamental way that cities fund their operations. There are lots of variables. There are fancy things like urban renewal, tax increment financing. We're not going to talk in detail about any of that, but it's all property taxes. Those are very flexible funds. Usually they go to what's called the general fund. There aren't a lot of strings attached to that, but there are a lot of demands on the general fund on that property tax revenue. Utility rates and fees, right? Water, sewer. We have miscellaneous other taxes. Beaverton has a hotel lodging tax. Some of those usually have strings attached to. They can't be used for just anything. We have state revenues. Cities get a share, not a big share, but a share of things like income tax, gas taxes, et cetera. We also have grants from the federal and state level. We'd love to have more. They're also not like reliable ongoing sources of revenue. They tend to be specific for particular purposes and projects, and they tend to be competitive. So some cities may be very successful in winning grants, but that often also means that there are cities that are maybe have the same needs, but are not successful in securing that grant funding. We have system development charges, which we're talking about today. And then I put down here debt. Debt is not a funding source. It's not revenue, but it's a really important tool, funding tool, financing tool that cities use, especially for capital projects. And so that's where SDCs kind of come into it. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so Beaverton context. So this is a kind of rudimentary map of Beaverton. The colors are different neighborhood organizations. You may notice the boundaries are a little complicated. Beaverton is in Washington County. We're bounded by Portland on the east. We've got Tigard to the south. We've got Hillsborough to the west, but we've got also a lot of unincorporated urbanized Washington County around Beaverton, which is part of why we've got this crazy boundary. So the county actually provides governance to a lot of areas that are not rural, that are around Beaverton and Washington County. We have also multiple service providers that levy SDCs. There are actually 4 water districts that serve Beaverton properties. One of them is controlled by the city, but not all of them. We also have county-wide sewer and stormwater service called Clean Water Services, and the city and Clean Water Services kind of share responsibility for providing those services. And there's complicated agreements that govern who's responsible for what. But generally speaking, CWS is responsible for like the county-wide regional stuff, and the city's responsible for like the local granular stuff. And then we have, on the county side, we have a county-wide transportation development tax. So this is a tax that applies to development in urbanized Washington County, and it's actually set by voters. So it's not subject to the SDC methodology that Elise alluded to. It's actually, it was on the ballot. And so it's extra inflexible because changes to that require literally going back to the voters. So it's actually a major driver in SDC. Okay, that was a pun. Transportation puns they kind of sneak up on you. But it's you'll see when I kind of expose our SDCs for a particular project, it's not a small amount. Beaverton is a suburb evolving into a more urban community. It's an exciting process. It's sometimes a painful process, but there's a lot of really exciting changes that are happening that require us to rethink the way we do things in a kind of fundamental way. So it's good, it's hard. And we're almost at 100,000 population. Like I feel like calling up PSU, like, are we there yet? Are we there yet? So just briefly, Beaverton takes housing seriously. It's a major city goal to find ways to better meet the housing needs of the community. We've had a 5-year housing action plan. The first one was in 2015. It's been updated a few times. It includes a lot of things that we do across the city to facilitate housing production. We also have diversity, equity, inclusion plan, climate action plan. I'm not going to talk about any of these in any detail, but I'm just kind of pointing out that there are a variety of overlapping policy visions and goals that shape city decision-making and sometimes also shape infrastructure investment decisions. So Elise did a good job on this one, so I'm not going to go too deep, but what can SDCs be used for? So capacity improvements, what does that mean? That means that we've got greenfield development, no sewer, maybe rural roads, no infrastructure. In order to produce housing in those areas, you have to build everything, right? It's kind of easy to understand what capacity improvements mean in that context where you're kind of starting from scratch. There's also infill development where you're creating more density, right? When, you know, a Beaverton neighborhood that was developed in the 1950s or 60s with, say, 100 homes, when that infrastructure was built, it wasn't built to accommodate 200 homes. It was built to accommodate 100 homes. So as infill happens, as redevelopment happens, the capacity of that infrastructure needs to be increased as a result of that development. And that capacity increase is that tie to SDCs, both in terms of the SDC charges for development and also in terms of the way the capital projects that construct those capacity improvements are funded. And the funding is sometimes complicated. SDC revenue can be used to pay back debt service on improvements that were already made. So for example, when the city undertakes a big capital project, a lot of times that's not paid up front. We kind of mortgage it, right? Through selling bonds, through taking out loans, and the service on that debt, you gotta make those payments. Those are funded by SDCs as well as by utility ratepayers. So SDCs are important as that kind of one-time thing, but also that flow of funds is what helps us and make big investments in infrastructure that need to last for a long time. And finally, just to say it again, SDCs can't be used for operations and maintenance. We can't use them to fix a sewer pipe that cracked unless it needs to be a bigger sewer pipe to accommodate growth. SDCs can't be used to just pave a street or fix potholes. They need to be used to serve a larger population of residents or businesses that basically is about the impacts and needs of that development, not simply the ongoing maintenance of the existing system. And again, this gets back to the methodology. The amount of those SDCs is based on the impact of that development and the relationship to specific projects and the estimated cost of those projects over time. So state law determines that methodology. Setting the SDC requires basically master planning. You have to look into the future and say what needs to happen in order to serve that future community. There are projections made for population growth, et cetera. And that's how we basically get to a project list, estimate the cost of that project list, and then say, okay, how does that then get fairly divided among the different types of development? And so that is when we say SDC methodology, that's what it's talking about. You have to define the universe of stuff that is going to be built by SDCs. And then you figure out how do you allocate that among the different development types. And there's room for that to be a nuance. There's room for that to be strategic, but it has to come back to that impact. Maybe the impact from an ADU is less than the impact from a detached single dwelling. Maybe the impact from a townhouse is different than either one of those things. Those are exactly the types of distinctions that the SDC methodology can and does draw. But if you haven't drawn those distinctions when you did your methodology, you can't just change it on an ad hoc basis, because then you're messing up your relationship between those SDC fees and what they're actually paying for. And then one of the other things that's important is that there are also these things called SDC credits, and I'll talk about that a little more in relationship to the infrastructure required to be built with development that is not actually an SDC. Okay, so this is where I start sharing the Beaverton specific information. So Beaverton updated the water SDC methodology recently. The time frame that included was 2020 to 2038. A total of $279 million in projects needs was identified for that time frame. And the SDC portion of that cost was identified as $164 million. And that, again, would be through either credits for work developers do and get reimbursed for, or direct payments. And then the difference between $279 million and $164 million comes from other revenue sources, usually ratepayers. So when you pay your water bill, right? If there are higher SDCs, that water bill can be lower. If the SDCs are lower, that water bill will be higher. A sample year for Beaverton revenue, again, we're sticking with water here. This is 2020. Now, years vary, right? This is just that snapshot. But in 2021, the city collected $1.5 million in water SDCs specifically, and $21 million from ratepayers. Now, remember, the ratepayers also pay for maintenance and water treatment, not just the capital projects that address growth in the system. And then on the spending side, again, snapshot, the city spent $30 million on capital projects for water. Didn't include maintenance and repair. That's those growth-oriented projects. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. The point is that different revenue sources have different constraints and strings attached. They are not all fungible. Again, that general fund money that comes from property taxes, very flexible, but in very high demand, limited by state law. Ratepayers, yeah, you can jack up those rates, but that's going to impact everyone, perhaps disproportionately people who are lower income. Here we get to a couple of specific project examples. These are both in South Cooper Mountain, which is a greenfield development area at the edge of Beaverton. It was added to the urban growth boundary in 2011. We did a community plan in 2015. And as development started, right, developers start coming in, filing land use applications. They've got to get water. They've got to get sewer, stormwater. So looking at water specifically, you'll see, and it's a little bit hard to see, I've got this arrow pointing to this green oval. There was a developer that was ready to come through the land use process to get entitlement to build a bunch of housing. There was no way to get water unless they went through the property of someone else, right? This was a major impediment. So we worked out an approach where the city negotiated purchase of an easement to build the water line through the neighboring property. There was a lot of persuasion involved, right? That's the kind of thing you can use eminent domain for, but you don't want to. You want to have a willing seller. But it was, we got there, the city built the portion of the water line that went through that neighboring property. The developer built that water line on their property that they controlled. That completed water line unlocked the development of thousands of units of housing, not only on the property of the developer that we were working with directly, but also in other parts of South Cooper Mountain. So SDCs finance this work in two ways. The city used $5.3 million, $910,000 from our SDC bucket that we had, right? And $4.5 million from bonds. Those bonds, again, backed by future SDC and ratepayer funds. The developer constructed portion was partly something that they were responsible for doing because it fell on the direct impact to development side, right? It was the water demand for the homes that the developer was proposing to build. But part of that project was also creating water infrastructure for other development that this developer was not proposing. And that portion of it was eligible for SDC credits. That means that developer built it, they got a coupon, and when it came time to pay the SDCs, instead of writing a check, they're like, I've got a coupon, so I don't owe as much because I built that stuff up front. It's a really important tool. Okay, here's the painful part. SDCs in Beaverton are high. This is SDCs for a single detached dwelling. I'm going to show a multifamily building next. I also am going to point out that this is where those other service providers come in. So the water, this was all Beaverton Water District. We've got 4 water districts in Beaverton. This is all the Beaverton controlled water district. The first one is that water SDC. We've got sewer, that's Clean Water Services, and also the city. It's pretty much set by Clean Water Services. So we collect it, and then we send most of it to this other service district that's independent jurisdiction. Stormwater, same, Clean Water Services in the city. TDT, the County Transportation Development Tax, set by voters on the ballot. It's a lot of money. In South Cooper Mountain, we have a supplemental transportation SDC because when we did the comprehensive planning, we had to look at how much it would cost to build all of the roads for this community. And we couldn't build it without extra SDCs. We set this figure at 75% of the actual cost, right? It could have been higher, right? And, basically like you look at it, you're like, oh, that's a lot of money. Okay, maybe we can do 75%, but then where does the rest of it come from, right? So that's where, well, that's going to come from ratepayers, which is a citywide income source. Then we have parks. Tualatin Hills Parks and Recreation District provide wonderful services, beautiful parks, very expensive SDC. And they actually had a higher level SDC for South Cooper Mountain for a similar reason that the city has a supplemental transportation SDC there. The total cost is, $48,512. It's one unit. That math is easy. So that's the per unit cost of SDCs for single detached housing in South Cooper Mountain and Beaverton. It's a little lower in other areas of the city because you don't have those supplemental SDC costs. Multifamily. This is a 75 unit building. The SDCs, again, it's much higher. We're talking about a bigger building. On a per unit basis though, it's much lower, right? It's 27,000, I mean, it's big, but it's lower than the single family, $27,492 per unit. I thought it was really interesting, the relationship between the proportional share of SDCs for different housing types, that for multifamily, it's that higher share. It might be a lower cost, but a higher share, right? So for those detached individual dwellings, those might be selling for $800,000 per unit. So even though the SDC is higher, the proportional share of the cost might be lower than the multifamily, even though the multifamily SDCs are lower per unit. So again, the relationship becomes very, very dynamic. Beaverton does a few things to mitigate the impact of SDCs on housing. I don't want to tell you that it is like perfect or enough. It's an ongoing process. We still have to pay for the infrastructure. So there are a lot of difficult judgment calls that are made. But we do defer payment of SDCs to occupancy, but not for detached single dwellings. The reason is that there's often a gap between the people that would pay the SDCs and the ultimate buyer. And if you go and you buy this new house and then they say, oh, wait, you can't move in yet. You have to pay this bill. You're like, what? So there are some reasons why that particular product is, we're more hesitant to defer SDCs to occupancy for that. However, for commercial and multifamily construction, we do defer to occupancy. As I mentioned, we will sometimes set SDC levels at lower than the actual analyzed cost. SDC credits, they're very useful. They're a really important tool. They're complicated. There's room for improvement there too. City also has a policy to backfill SDCs for regulated low-income housing development. We have to budget for that from the general fund. So it's not easy, and sometimes it's hard to do that. I don't think that we promise to it every time, but that's the intent, and we have been doing that in recent years. But we don't backfill for SDCs that we don't ultimately have. So we don't backfill, for example, for the parks SDC. We do it for the SDCs where we're actually going to be receiving the revenue. But we do work with our partners like THPRD to encourage them to also think about how their SDCs affect housing and to encourage them to think about the community in a broader sense, rather than what their very focused individual mission might be. And then just a few concluding thoughts. The report's great. The executive summary is wonderful. The conclusion is wonderful if you don't have the stomach for like 200 hour pages, but I have read all of them. And I think the analysis really supports those conclusions. Funding for infrastructure, it's limited. And we need infrastructure actually in order to create housing. So there is, it's a double-edged sword. Infrastructure costs like SDCs can be a hurdle that not every potential housing development can overcome. But if we can't build infrastructure, to a certain extent, we can't build housing. And then finally, and then we haven't really talked about it a lot, but there are all these policy goals. They're sometimes in tension that it's like a lot of aspirations and not a lot of resources, and making those judgment calls is really hard sometimes, which is not to say that there aren't win-win situations. We always are looking for those. And as we think about state policy with regard to SDCs, there's a whole construction here, and there is definitely concern that if you just start pulling out pieces, then you might lose the ability to kind of do what it's intended to do. So that's just that kind of cautionary note. So I'm done.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to ask the first question, but I'd encourage anybody else who has a question to step up to our unfortunately fixed microphone. And we'll have about 10 minutes for questions. So one thing I like to consider when we're talking about an existing system that's been in place for a long time and the potential for its reform, which I think is one of the ideas, is how can we modify or reform this, is what if we had a different history, and what if we were to change it radically in a way that we'll all stipulated it's not going to happen because this has been in place for many years, 30 years, 40 years. What if there were no SDCs? Would we have an explosion of housing production? Would we have a collapse of public infrastructure? Would we be able to find those sources from elsewhere? How would the system look? So I was just curious if you had any thoughts on, if we could start over, how might we distribute those costs differently using the existing funding mechanisms that we have? Sure.
And I'd be happy to speculate on what I think would happen to the production side. If you just deleted 5% of costs, you'd get a whole lot of folks moving to the market quickly to try to deliver into that lower cost environment. Land would get bid up over the course of 12 to 18 months and make up the difference. So you'd probably get a short-term increase in supply. I mean, you can maybe draw a parallel to what happened between 2016 and 2017 in Portland. It was the inverse. There was a new cost of sorts coming in inclusionary housing. So a bunch of people rushed to market before it happened. So same type of thing. That was avoidance of it rather than benefiting from it. But that's what I suspect would happen.
If SDC disappear as a funding source and is not replaced by something, there will be many infrastructure projects that cannot move forwards because there's not the funding for either paying for it upfront or financing it over time. And that will have an impact on housing production also. And I think, maybe not right away, but it will certainly. I think the examples of the water line projects illustrate that. And then in the longer term, there's the question, right? Do rates go up? Is the share of property taxes that is spent from the general fund on infrastructure, is that going to have to go up? What happens when that runs up against state law, which of course it kind of would immediately? What kind of other services would need to be cut in order to pay for the infrastructure that is deemed to be the highest priority? And that's going to look different in every jurisdiction because jurisdictions have different tax rates under the state law. There was a kind of arbitrary nature to that actually that Elise didn't mention, but jurisdictions kind of were caught at different points in terms of what they could levy for property taxes. So they're like Tigard has a very different maximum tax rate than Beaverton does. It's like we're right next door, but our situation is different under state law for that. So it has implications for both the ability of jurisdictions to provide services and tough decisions that get made about how public resources are allocated if there's no replacement for that SDC revenue to create infrastructure.
I'll just add, one of the details of the report, which I thought was pretty interesting, is about a third of Oregon cities don't have SDCs at all. So there's a interesting natural experiment of places that we've worked recently, like Almsville or Island City, that just they don't have them. So, but those places may not also have much demand for new housing production. So these things kind of balance out. So please, Michael.
Thanks.
I think so.
Thank you. Elise mentioned timing. There are two bills in the legislature right now that might make incremental changes to SDC policy. I would love to know how much Paul likes them and how much Anna is scared of them. On the timing issue, SB 847 might possibly include something that would shift collection of SDCs to the occupancy permit. I guess apparently the home builder is working on drafting a possible carve out for the case that the cities are most worried about, which is the subdivision, single family subdivisions, where you have to collect it from the buyer, the individual. And the other case is in 2984, House bill to exempt some or all SDCs for adaptive reuse of commercial properties, downtown switching from commercial to residential use, that sort of thing. I'd love your takes.
On the first one, I think, moving collections from said yours at me. Moving collections from your building permit to certificate of occupancy is the example I used. It's just the finance cost to carry from that, 0.0 in your construction process to whenever you occupy. I use 2 years and $2 million at 6% or $120,000. Certainly helpful. I mean, but that's sort of on the margin. I think what would be much more helpful is getting it out of the capital cost stack entirely and moving it into some period of occupancy, because dealing with it with your sale or refinance would be so much more helpful, because then it doesn't show up as a cost to the project and doesn't require financing at all. The government is providing that minimal amount of leverage. That one, the second one was about the adaptive reuse. I think that's a whole lot of effort for what will ultimately be very little fruit. The bar depths of office buildings are too deep. About 70 feet is as wide as you can make use efficiently for residential. That's 2 apartments in a corridor. Once you start getting wider than that, which most office buildings are, you've got a lot of wasted space. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is, the buildings that tend to be smaller also tend to be older and need seismic upgrades. That's tremendously expensive. The cost to retrofit isn't that different from the cost to build. So I personally don't think we're in need of adaptive reuse. I think we're in need of demolition. With that said, if you can start removing some of the policy obstacles, then yeah, sure, it helps. It all helps. Someone advocated recently that we should exempt retrofits from seismic upgrades, and I sort of winced at it because that's a life safety thing. And their point was, well, there's old buildings all over the city. What makes them any different? I don't know. I don't know what, I'm used to building new buildings that are seismically resilient. So I sort of live in that space, but yeah, maybe putting money into old buildings that aren't seismically resilient is worth doing, because we need housing. So someone needs to deal with the clash of virtues on this stuff.
On the deferral to occupancy, I think I actually described it. Beaverton already does that for a lot of development. Again, the concern would be for where the buyer doesn't have transparency. And sometimes there's if you're talking about a subdivision with hundreds of homes, the record keeping on that would probably be kind of a nightmare. Hi, I'm a bureaucrat. The adaptive reuse, honestly, I don't worry about that too much. Beaverton has a very low commercial vacancy rate, and so it wouldn't really affect us. I don't think nickel and diming SDCs is really that helpful. I think if we want to think about other ways of funding infrastructure fundamentally, we should ask those big questions. rather than just kind of ticking away at it. But I did see a piece of draft legislation that I liked, which is, and I can't remember the number, but it would basically, the state would reimburse jurisdictions that that waived SDCs for low-income housing. That would be something that I think would have a direct benefit for affordable housing developers. And it would keep that SDC methodology intact for cities. We wouldn't be pretending that affordable housing development has no impact, because it does. You still need to provide services for those people. My question though, I don't know how that proposal will fare. I don't know how the state plans to pay for it or whether it's long-term. But that would certainly be something that would be probably fruitful to implement at the local level.
Do you have a take on Paul's amended time moving into the occupancy period for collection?
I mean, beyond occupancy. Well, so you mentioned LIDs, which is interesting. There's another tool called reimbursement districts that Beaverton just created some enabling legislation for. I think, it's interesting in South Cooper Mountain, when we were trying to figure out all the funding tools, the city actually said, hey, property owners and developers, let's do an LID. And they were like, oh no. The way an LID works is that the property owners start paying that tax immediately, even though they might not actually develop for X years. So I understand what you're saying. It's a really good tool for the toolkit. I don't know that other developers would necessarily agree with you.
I was thinking more about the financing tool rather than the literal implementation. The idea of just carrying the sum, via a long-term debt vehicle, that subordinates it, to be clear.
So the reimbursement district it works slightly differently. It allows for a developer to build a piece of infrastructure that's needed in order to unlock their development potential, basically. Let's say there's an intersection that needs to be signalized, 4 corners. What a property owner on one corner wants to move forward, well, they need to upgrade the intersection. A reimbursement district would allow the cost for that to be distributed among all 4 corners. But importantly, those other properties wouldn't have to pay until they develop. So it allows that cost of that piece of infrastructure to be shared in a way, though, that is maybe not 100% certain for the developer that builds it, but is fair in terms of allowing for it to be shared at all. I don't think that it would replace SDCs, but I think it's a good complement.
Let's get a couple more questions, please.
Hi. So you mentioned that jurisdictions can come up with their own SDC methodology. And I was wondering if there was any appetite or interest in a streamlined SDC framework or like a model code.
So the question is about why does it take a year and $100,000 to set SDC rates? And I mean, not that you have direct answers to that, but it's a very careful, very complex process for even establishing the rates at all. Is there a way to streamline that?
So I asked our city engineer about this because I thought the answer would be, oh, the state makes it so hard. That is not what I heard. And it's not to say that, he's the last word on it, but I think it cost about $75,000 to update the water SDC methodology for Beaverton a few years ago. And again, from that engineering perspective, they thought that it was a rational process. I would not say that there wouldn't be room for improvement, but I'm not an expert on this.
I think this is one of those areas where you see sort of the differences between what's happening in affordable housing and some of the the report was not for recommendations. Some of the observations that the report saw in ways to make this process a little easier and a little more streamlined. And so I think that there were findings that showed that exemptions can have an effect on how and where affordable housing is developed. And I think that if I hearken back to sort of what Andrea was saying after our lunch, was the need to get really creative about the way that we finance. And again, I think about affordable housing because I work for the Housing Finance Agency. So I have a different perspective, but I think the need to get creative of additional financial mechanisms that support specifically the development of affordable housing, because what we see from the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis is when we break it up into income brackets, the folks that need housing so severely are those who are living at 80% or below the area median income. And so the bill that Anna was mentioning, I think, is a step in a direction to say, what are other sources of financing specifically that we can use in the development and incentivization, the way that any other development, whether that's LIFT or LIHTC, the low income housing tax credit, it incentivizes development. What incentivizes the infrastructure for development of affordable housing, I think, is a conversation of minds and brilliant folks to come together and really look at what that could be and the ways that we can fill the holes that is creative and beyond system development charges.
Great. I think we're over time. Madeline Shing, can we do it after? Okay, sorry. So we're 4 minutes over time. Thank you so much, everybody, especially to the panelists. I really appreciate your taking the time to prepare and speak with us today. And let's have a hand.